What's up, world? I'm Matt Newberg from Hungry, and this is The Feed. Each episode, we'll dive into conversations with the industry insiders who are leveraging technology to shape the way we eat. On today's episode of The Feed, I sat down with Elliot Roth, founder of Spira, a startup growing algae to be used in protein, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and pigments. In this episode, we'll talk about Elliot's personal journey of growing his own spirulina algae while he was food insecure, how algae can replace harmful petrochemicals found in our clothes and food, and the future of hyperlocal distributed food systems. Okay, so you have a really fascinating background. I would love for you to talk about your personal experience with food security that brought you to algae.
Yeah.
What that experience of growing it and eating it for 2.5 months, I believe, what that was like.
Yeah. I mean, I was in a really crappy, what's the cursing level?
Oh, you can do whatever you want. We'll just market YouTube.
Well,
over 18.
I was in a real shitty situation post undergrad, and I had set up this laboratory, and I was fiddling around in the lab, and I don't know, like so many of my 22-year-old friends at the time, they were all moving back home with their parents.
Mm-hmm.
I think like half of all millennials still live with their parents, which is ridiculous. And so I was kind of, not to say my parents were bad people or anything like that. My mom was like, come home, like the overbearing Jewish mother that she was. She was like, come home, like, let me take care of you. And I was like, no, mom, like I can figure it out. And I had this laboratory that I built in undergrad, just like dumpster diving for equipment and put it together in a friend's garage space. And I was like, all right, I could use this lab, do some consulting projects, make enough money to actually support myself. Turns out that I couldn't make enough money to support myself. I had some clients that never paid me. I had some contracts that fell through, and I started couch surfing. And the only thing left that I really had, I had like negative $17 in my bank account at one point. I was subsisting on my friend's expired subscription to Soylent.
Oh, wow.
And then another friend worked as the manager at Panera, so I'd pop on by and get Ed to give me a bag of bagels whenever I could, and then whatever I could find behind like the Food Lion, Right. So, or Kroger.
That people were just talking.
Oh yeah, all this food waste. But it kind of occurred to me, I was like, hey, like I have this laboratory. I might as well try to figure out if I can produce something that meets all my basic nutritional needs. Right. I have this tiny space. It was like 800 square feet garage space that we converted. And I have a background in like genetics, synthetic biology. I should be able to figure out like what is something that I could grow that meets my nutritional requirements. Because like that's my only cost if I'm living on couches. And right. I like looked around, and I'm a big space geek. So I grew up going to Space Coast, Florida. My grandma and my dad's side of the family is like from Space Coast. And so every winter I would be there like watching rockets go off and all sorts of stuff like that. So I was like, all right, like NASA has had to have solved this in some kind of way. Right. Tiny space, no resources, no money, whatever, growing it on waste. What exists that could provide for nutritional needs. And initially I was like, like vertical farming, it was the big craze back in 2016. And I was thinking like maybe that could provide for nutritional needs. And
Sounds expensive.
It's like expensive and like micronutrients, sure. But like everything else, nah, not really. And what I was looking at in terms of my total cost, I like made some spreadsheets. I was like, all right, what I really want is something that's akin to Soylent that I can grow myself. Mm-hmm. And the majority of the cost was going to come from mostly protein. Protein is one of the most expensive macro ingredients. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, what is this out there? And what could I grow that could meet my protein requirements? And I came across algae in this NASA research, and I was like, I could grow this. And it was in the middle of a blizzard in like January of 2016 when I ordered my first starter culture from somebody out in California who was growing it. And I got my starter culture in the mail, probably like as the snow was melting, and started growing it late January, early February. And this was about 7 years ago now. And took like these aquarium tanks I got donated from friends. And these are like 10-gallon aquarium tanks. And I had probably like 12 of them or something like that, at least when I was getting started. And then I got some bigger ones. But I would take big scoops of algae out of these aquarium tanks. I got like a little aquarium bubbler. You just need some salt to get it going. And then whatever, like distilled water or something like that. We already had a water system set up in the lab. So I was getting it started and growing it and having this like mesh net that I would dip in and squeeze it out. You kind of like squeeze it sort of like cottage cheese or like you're making cheese.
This is spirulina, right?
Spirulina, yeah. And so I would strain it and squeeze it out, and I would get like this big ball, like this big clump of it, and sort of cheesy, but like most of the water removed, maybe about 30% moisture content. And I would take that and I would eat that either just like plain, I would just toss it, just straight eat it.
Okay.
Or like I said, I would use it as a spread, or you like add it to water, mix it into a smoothie. Or some of the other things I would do is I would like try different experiments, like cook with it and see what happens if I bake it or other things like that. So that's how I got started. And I did that. I mean, every day I would go in and I would take another tank, right? And so I tried to do
a day's worth.
Yeah, as a day's worth. And it took about probably like a week to replenish or so. But I was getting like a big glob of it out of each of the tanks. And I did that as kind of my main protein for a couple months. And then I was talking to everybody. I was like, hey, everybody, you should grow algae and be free. And like, you don't need that much space or resources to do it.
Yeah.
And I started getting involved in the farmers market circuit, and then starting to reach out to people in accelerator programs and incubators, because I'd always been interested in business as a force for change in the world and impact. And I figure, if I was making a significant impact, like eating all of this, I wasn't worried too much about rent at the time. I was just living with friends and bouncing around. And so, my costs were virtually nothing. I was fully self-actualized however I could. And I really wanted to go about spreading what I discovered in terms of algae and eating algae with everybody possible.
Wow. I love that. I mean, dog fooding your own product and really understanding like the needs.
Yeah, people, I've talked to investors and told them that story, and they were like, well, you don't have to be ramen profitable anymore. You could just like eat your own algae and that good green, get high on my own supply, I guess. It's just, I mean, like the key learning in all of that though was that like fresh algae has no taste. And so like my aha moment in that experience was like, okay, I tried the powdered stuff initially because it was going to be easier to just get the powdered stuff and mix it into a smoothie or something like that. That's what Soylent does, right? Like you have this powder, blend it up, whatever. And so I initially got the powdered stuff, but I tried that compared to the fresh stuff I was growing, and I was like, wow, like the powdered stuff is this bitter, alkaline, umami, kind of like nasty, oceanic tasting thing. And the fresh stuff kind of is like nutty, almost like blended avocado. It's got this like very interesting like mouthfeel texture, cheesiness to it. And so I was like, okay, this is like a world of difference. What's going on here? And in particular, I did a deep dive into the flavor genetics and into the like background of the olfactory pathways and everything else that's produced in spirulina and what happens when it's processed and degrades in a particular way. And that's what led to a bunch of insights about pulling out the pigments, leaving a protein, being able to work with that protein, being able to have this like pigment that could serve as a replacement for artificial colors. But like that initial aha, I didn't come back around to that until probably like a year and a half later or something like that.
But the powder stuff you would have had to have bought, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was like pretty expensive at the time because this stuff is coming from mostly overseas, importing into the United States and grown by smallhold farmers all over the world.
So I think people are definitely familiar with seaweed, but I guess break down algae as a kingdom, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And give us the layman kind of definition of algae, and also maybe talk about kind of the protein completeness of like all the amino acids that could really help us, use this as an alternative protein.
Yeah, of course. So algae is kind of like a generic. It's really algae is kind of classified as any aquatic species, anything that's green that grows in water. And so that could either mean one of three things. So either you have macroalgae like seaweed, kelp, nori, dulse, different kind of species that grow off the coast of the ocean on the continental shelf. They end up growing in ocean water and salt water and then getting light from the sun and growing and doing that kind of thing. Then you have microalgae, which are eukaryotic. And so those microalgae end up having a nucleus. They end up going through division, mitotic division, and everything associated with having a nucleus itself. And then you have cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria are more like bacteria that can photosynthesize. And so each of these three categories, we can label the generic algae under each of those. And one of the best things about focusing in on this particular type of food source is that it really is the original food source for the planet. So back about 2.5 billion years ago, we had one of the first extinction events happen. So like imagine the Earth as like this big soupy mix and very hot, very like lots of chemicals, lots of heat going on. And you had a lot of organisms that subsisted on these like heat and chemical reactions. And then all of a sudden, like one of the organisms mutated and evolved photosynthesis. And then it started consuming CO2 because there was this big excess CO2 all around it, and then giving off oxygen. And so by consuming that CO2, giving off the oxygen, it started multiplying more and more. That oxygen is really toxic to all of these other anaerobic bacteria, right, that were all around it. And so the first photosynthetic organisms gave rise to the first great extinction event and all of the oxygen that we currently breathe. So 20% of the air around us is oxygen. Most of that stems from cyanobacteria or algae that was birthed in the fires of the initial stages of Earth. And that cyanobacteria, as like a fundamental base level of the food pyramid, provides tons of nutrition for higher orders of organisms. So like the plants that we eat are just very complicated, mutated over time cyanobacteria that initially was founded in the beginnings of Earth. So back to your original question about nutrition, in particular, a lot of the species of algae that we focus on, because they're the foundational base of the food pyramid, they also make up the majority of the macros and the micros that we need as a means of like supplying our own nutrition. They're as close you can get to direct energy transfer from the sun as possible in order to produce the basic ingredients that we end up using. So the spirulina that we end up growing and working with farmers to produce, that has something on the order of all essential amino acids. It's got a really balanced amino acid profile as well. It has 13 vitamins, 8 minerals, most of your recommended daily amounts of all of your micronutrient requirements as well.
Amazing. Wow. So this is like the most efficient form of protein, it sounds like, if you're talking about the closest thing to getting energy from the sun.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing that I would say could potentially leapfrog, there's probably two things, actually. One of them is humans being able to photosynthesize. And there was this really fun paper by Christina Agabakis back in I think 2010s or something like that, where she calculated that it would take the surface area of a basketball court for a human to photosynthesize directly from the sun and get all your energy from the sun. So probably not going to happen anytime soon. But the second thing would be any sort of cell-free synthesis. So doing it without all of the cellular mechanics or machinery, being able to say, hey, let's go from a photon, hydrogen, carbon, and produce something out of that. We're a little bit far off from that. I think also the energy required to get over that hurdle is necessitated by enzymes, and a cell produces those enzymes already. So there are a couple of ways that might be able to get even more efficient, but truth be told, I think just relying on what nature already has produced as a really efficient method of transferring light energy into foodstuffs is really beneficial. And we see that with plants already, any plant-based foods, plant-based meats, all of that is kind of relying on one of the lower levels of the food ecosystem. It's just I'm trying to take it even lower than that,
When you talk about this food pyramid, can you help us actually visualize what's at the top and what's at the bottom?
Yeah. So, think of this like any kind of food web, or trophic pyramid is what it's called. And trophic levels are just a biological concept to say, what is the energy transfer? And so if you're going from the sun, which is really the base level of everything, the earth really subsists on the basis of the energy we get from the sun. Well, the organisms that are in direct contact with that sunlight then feed energy up from the sun to get to us. And so when you're thinking of plants, they are receiving light from the sun. We then end up eating animals that eat those plants, which is a little bit less efficient than just eating the plants themselves. And so to that point, like the lower that we get in these like food pyramids or food webs, the more efficient we are at producing the base level nutrition that we need to survive.
Fascinating. And so at the top is animals, because animals graze on the plants that...
Right. And so there are some that like diets and other things like that. I don't want to be exclusionary or anything like that. I think that any omnivorous diet really requires diversity, especially because you want to make sure that your gut microbiome is diverse. You want to make sure that you're subsisting on things in a seasonal manner too, or more localized manner. And so in particular, when I take a look at what we can provide is a steady source of baseline nutrition that replaces and displaces more harmful sources of nutrition in a more localized fashion. So, I mean, my dream with Spira is to go about displacing many of these more harmful supply chains and working on more localized food structures so that we never have to worry about people ever needing to struggle to survive. Like food is and should be a basic human right. To be able to have your baseline nutritional needs met, no one should be starving in the United States. No one should be starving in the world.
Totally.
Yeah. So a lot of what I've done in the past also has been working towards that overall goal.
Fascinating. So I would love for you to like talk about all these different applications, I guess current and potential.
Sure.
So starting with current, and then maybe you can tell us about the dye in your hair.
Yeah, of course.
The story behind that.
So what we've been working on currently in particular is more angled towards a problem that I see in food business models just in general. So one of the key challenges that I see with food companies that are trying to get started is that they're competing with entrenched industries that have the ability to command a much lower price point.
Right.
And in the event of like any kind of economic hardship or anything like that, people immediately go to what is the cheapest, what is the most cost effective to get like calories in the door. And we have these entrenched agriculture, like industrial agriculture systems that are going to be really hard to undo or redo. And so in particular, what my team has started taking a look at, rather than going directly towards plant-based protein, which already we have very cheap sources of pea, soy protein, other kinds of different plant protein that is out there. Instead of adding into the mix, I think of it kind of like a new standard of like USB, like you have all of these different standards of things and you're trying to compare and they're all just doing the same kind of thing. Right. Instead, what I thought we would do is something really unique and differentiated in the sense of replacing artificial dyes and colors. And in particular, because you only need a tiny amount of artificial dye in order to make a real impact. So when you look at all these different artificial dyes and colors in food products, most of them are derived from something called coal tar. And coal tar,
yeah, I think it's in my shampoo.
It's
my dandruff
it's the bottom of the barrel, right? Like if you're using like something like Selsun Blue, right? Like it uses blue dye number 1, blue dye number 2, right? So that's in food products, that's in cosmetics, that's in our clothing dyes. All of this is made from artificial colors that are derived from petrochemicals, and you see this in the rainbow shimmer on top of asphalt after it rains, or like that iridescent shine in gasoline. All of that is what you're consuming. And so when you take a look at like Halloween and you look at a kid's candy basket and you realize like they're choking down coal tar all the time, and realize that parents have started to recognize this and started to say, hey, like this is enough. We shouldn't have this in our supply chain. So one of the great things about working with photosynthesis and photosynthetic organisms, they naturally use all the colors of the rainbow to absorb sunlight. And so we can tap into the different species of algae that are growing that already naturally produce these colors and these pigments as a means of displacing these artificial dyes. We started in food, we're going into cosmetics right now, eventually with the goal of reaching textiles. But one of the core challenges here of any natural dye in particular is that it needs to have the same impact, the same effects as an artificial dye. So a lot of what we do in the laboratory is do protein engineering and genetic engineering on the pigments themselves so that they're color fast, so that they're stable, so that they're able to be used in high temperatures, acidic environments, so that when you pick the flavor of Gatorade and you pick your specific color of favorite Gatorade, you can say like, oh yeah, they're red. It's if you know for sure that you're not eating like leftover oil gunk. So like that's kind of the main point we focused on these pigments because it's something really high value and low volume that we can sell at the very beginning as a means of getting the company starting to turn a profit and sustain ourselves as we drive towards kind of larger bulk supply.
And then what are you looking, like you're going to start with the pigments, and then the next applications would be algae-based meat or whatever, plant-based?
Potentially. Like one of the key things that I take a look at is it's kind of like the Tesla Roadster approach, right? You want to start out something pretty high value and then come down the cost curve over time as you get more and more volume. And so when we're taking a look at this business model, I start out with pigments and like flavor ingredients, different kind of texturizers, things that can add like to scent and fragrances. And then coming on down even further, industrial enzymes, things that are used in the production of like cheeses or things that are used in different kind of food preparation, especially. And then after that, then that's when we start getting into edible proteins and bulk supply. And then even beyond that, because we're trying to use all parts of the algae that we're producing, and pigments are a small fraction, and then you have proteins, you have lipids, you have carbohydrates, and we can start getting into other sort of macro ingredients and other kind of markets as well. So my team has a strong background in genetics, and we also have a strong background in chemical engineering. And that key background is to focus on kind of like using all parts of the buffalo. You want to use all parts of your organism, all parts of the algae. We start with pigments, we go towards proteins. Eventually, I'm hoping to hit plastics and then other specialty pharmaceuticals and other ingredients.
Wow.
So like the 4 Ps of algae, I guess.
Pharmaceuticals, plastics, proteins, and pigments.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Plastics, I had no idea.
Yeah. Lots of, like when you think of, let's say like corn as an example, right? It's got quite a bit of carbohydrates in there. And so all of those sugars can either be turned into something like high fructose corn syrup, or corn stalks are processed now into bioplastics. And they're used as kind of like leftover additives or blending agents or other things like that to create the different kind of bioplastics that we use in cutlery or single-use plastics.
Amazing. So I guess give us like the Spira high-level pitch and what your business model is, who you're working with today.
Yeah.
If you're allowed to say.
Yeah, of course. I mean, key to what we're trying to do is really reinvent the supply chain. And so very, very high level, we work on displacing extractive industries, stuff like industries like oil and gas, other things of that nature, in order to produce a regenerative supply chain, something in which that we can displace harmful compounds and work on genetically engineering these different compounds and materials so that we can actually enable an even better world than we could have ever imagined. So it's kind of like enabling that solar punk future of sorts that I think that everybody really wants to happen. And the clear path to me is basically tapping into these tiny self-replicating machines, these little algae organisms that have the ability of consuming CO2 and turning it into stuff, right? So, I would say some of the companies and clients that we worked with some pretty big brands across the spectrum. We did work with Molson Coors, Colgate. We've done a little work with Kellogg. We've done work with big fashion brands, small ones too. We've done work with BMW. We did a cool project with them as well. So quite a few companies that you probably heard of, and then many companies you probably haven't heard of, but will, I hope, hear from in the future. We've sent out thousands and thousands of samples now. Our client list is now a couple thousand long as well. And so many of them are just now dipping their toes in and experimenting. And so we're really looking to scale all of this up in the future.
And it's all for the use case right now, just to be clear, around pigments.
Yes. Right? Yeah. Just around pigments currently. A lot of our research and development goes into improving upon the pigments that we currently offer. So we now have a full color spectrum of pigments. We have RGB, right? And yellow. So we are about to release some new pigments coming on up as well. We have some of them coming in. And then beyond pigments, we're starting to get at these more engineered materials and proteins, like the different things that would then help aid in the construction of something like an algae burger, which is what you were talking about.
Yes, I have tried that Akua burger.
Oh, they're fantastic. Yeah. What's kind of crazy is that there's a bit of an algae mafia. Like, we all know each other a little bit.
Yeah.
So if you met one of us and you ask, like, hey, do you know Elliot? They'll probably say, yeah, I've talked to him before. Yeah. When I was getting started, I talked to all of these different algae companies to see why they failed as well. And one of the key lessons learned is that sort of business model approach of, if you're producing a product, start with something high end.
Totally.
And then work your way down.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's the total, I think, Peter Thiel, that whole approach of, start with the Model S and move to the Model 3, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned something about carbon negative. I would love for you to talk about, like, why growing algae is a more environmentally friendly process than other, protein sources. And
sure.
Yeah, talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, algae is incredibly efficient at absorbing CO2. By some metrics, about half of the weight of algae is carbon, right? And so what that means is that as we grow algae, and just to keep it in people's minds, it's in these big ponds. So we're growing most of our algae in these very shallow ponds. That's where it kind of naturally grows, in these very like alkali lakes and ponds.
All outside.
Yeah, all outside, covered greenhouses mostly.
Okay.
Places like India, Peru, Thailand, Indonesia, all over the world. I work with 83 farms right now, and we can produce about 250 million liters of algae in our various farms. There was just like a fermentation industry report that was released that said they only produce about 25 million liters collectively in the entire fermentation industry. So, I mean, we're already doing about 10 times that, and I've spent $0 on the actual production capacity just because I'm working with farmers instead of having to build and put together these like steel in the ground fermentation plants.
Wow.
And so in particular, when I look at the efficiency of us being able to do this, and in addition, the fact that it consumes CO2, not produces CO2, I think that what we're doing is a lot more effective way of producing the base level proteins that people require to survive and thrive. So a lot of what we're up to when you're asking about kind of like how it grows, where it grows, how it's carbon negative, passively, because these are alkali ponds, they'll absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So the more surface area that we have, the more CO2 that they'll absorb. The second thing that's really important to note is that we ship by boat, and so that reduces our overall impact on the carbon supply chain. And then in addition, after that, what we do is we displace petrochemical-based compounds. And so if I'm displacing something that would be a petrochemical-based color, as an example, like a blue dye 1, blue dye 2, that means that there's no reason for those ever to be produced ever again. And we completely remove oil compounds from the supply chain.
Wow.
And that's the dream, right? Because then you have a net infinite carbon displacement impact. Because like if the assumption is that they'll consistently use it for the rest of time if they don't have an alternative, and they use something that's algae based and carbon negative, then yeah, you have something that'll completely remove it from the supply chain. And that's the dream for every company out there.
Do we have a sense of, just when it comes to these dyes that are currently being used, how much of a carbon footprint that is?
Yeah. So something to be said about the reason to start high-end and low volume means that the actual impact on the supply chain is pretty minimal until you reach something like textile dyes. And so when you consider food dyes, the impact is pretty minimal. It's normally like the last kind of ingredient in a food label. When you consider cosmetics, unless you're talking about color cosmetics, it's a little minimal too, but you're having more of the percent of the product as the color itself. And then when you're talking about clothing, that dye is hugely impactful and very harmful for the environment. And so we're starting with food in particular just because you're consuming it and people feel that impact immediately. As we get to textiles, we'll make more and more of an impact on the colors and be able to produce more and more ingredients outside of just colors too.
And then maybe talk a little bit about like the inputs like water and how much less water it uses versus other.
Oh yeah. On some metrics, this is we did a like kilo per kilo comparison to something like beef as an example. And I believe it was producing over 2,000 kilos per hectare per season, whereas beef would only produce something like 1. So on orders of magnitude, it's 2,000 times as efficient or something as beef at minimum.
From a land perspective?
From a land use perspective, yeah. From a water usage perspective, we can hit about 200 times efficiency, something like that. Partially because like water usage is a little bit of a misnomer, because whatever water you start with is the only water you ever need, as long as you help prevent evaporation. And so if you start with something on the order of like 1,000 liters, over the course of 1,000 liters, and probably the size of this table, over the course of 3 months, the density of algae would multiply to be the entire mass of the world's oceans, because it doubles every day. Wow. And it's it's incredibly fast growing. Like, just think of how quickly algae blooms form. That's how quickly algae grows, right? And so you only really need the volume of water that you start with. I never had to re-up water in any of the algae that I was growing, any of the algae tanks that I was producing to feed myself. And then in terms of energy costs, if you're growing outdoors, sunlight is free. So we have some farms that have 0 energy costs. I mean, maybe a paddle wheel or something like that as a means of mixing the algae to make sure that it doesn't like settle or float or other things like that. But besides that, some of our farms just subsist on natural buoyancy of the algae and never actually mix it and never use any energy except sunlight.
Wow. Fascinating. So I'd love for you to like break down the kind of start to finish process of like how you go from, gene editing, the DNA to getting this out to the farmers for them to grow at scale, and then having it come back and then process that and then ship it off to a client. Like, give us the kind of the traceability on that.
The kind of like farm to table aspect. Okay. Like I tell people that I liken my company to if Monsanto and Standard Oil had a baby, to undo the damage of both those companies. Wow. And it's partially because I love this idea of using the tools. These kind of tools are double-sided, right? It's like nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. So using the tools that were perpetuated to do evil as a means of undoing the damage of a lot of what has been done in the past. And so in particular, we focus on using genetic engineering and those tools to kind of create a Willy Wonka style effect. So like if I can make the snozberries taste like snozberries, I would. I really want to take algae and kind of craft it and create all sorts of crazy experiences for people. And in doing so, what we do is we start with DNA and create designer materials that fit whatever specifications the customers want. So like you can solve tons of downstream processes and problems if you say from the very beginning, we're going to do something with the customer in mind, and we're going to do something that already meets their needs. And so from the very start, what we do is we work with our strains of algae. We work with the DNA as a means of making sure that our colors and pigments have stability. And then with those strains, you take like a little test tube, and you only need a little bit to get started. So we send that off to the farm. The farm then has it double every single day. So from that like tabletop size amount, you can get tons and tons and tons over the course of a couple of months. And they go from that little test tube, and it doubles and it doubles and it doubles. And eventually you have a big pond. And then you have a sieve that you carry through. And this is just something where you put a pump in, put it through the sieve, but it's a normal kind of filter. This is something that a lot of fermentation companies have difficulty with, but because we're dealing with this big noodle-like organism, it's just like straining spaghetti in essence. So you strain the organism out, you strain like the algae out of there, you then scrape it, you press it, you potentially wash it as well to remove some residual salts, and then you dry it. And many of our farmers end up using either solar drying, which is a hugely low energy technique, or spray drying. I've been trying to shift them over to more low energy methods of drying, especially because lower temperature, low energy end up having a better taste and flavor impact. They then send the powder itself to some third-party processing partners that we have that end up using our proprietary processing technology as a means of separating out the pigments from everything else. And those pigments then are packaged and sent here to our warehouse, which we then ship out to customers all over the world. And so we are working to make those supply chains a little bit more localized so that we can ship directly from the processor to the client themselves. But as it stands right now, a lot of what we do here is applications testing. And so think of it like, hey, if you wanted to make a burger that was using an algae red instead of beet juice or using anything like that, you could do that here. We have tested out different things like butter and cheese replacements. We've done different things here where we've tested out all kinds of different beverages, all kinds of different foodstuffs. And so we do a lot of the prototyping here in LA. We do a lot of our research and development here in LA. And then we end up sending it out to the clients. So we partner with them as a means of figuring out exactly what they need as a means of replacing those artificial colors that they're using or other sort of like more harmful food ingredients and raw materials in their supply chain.
Fascinating. So like how do those farmers get compensated if they're not necessarily they're like partner farmers, but there's some sort of looser partnership? Like how does the business model support this kind of externalized process of farming it?
Yeah. So I think core to our ethos and our belief is that farmers should be at the core of in the center of ecosystem change when it comes to food. And we should really support and celebrate and cherish these farmers. And so what we do is many of these farms have just been growing and selling locally algae as a supplement. And so they have an ancient tradition. I mean, spirulina has been around since the time of the Aztecs. And it's kind of like the Kinembu tribe around Lake Chad has been growing it since forever. And who am I to come along and tell them how to do it different or better or whatever, right? So we lean pretty heavy on our farmers' experience and then support them by actively paying more than a living wage to them when they're in these different developing countries. We end up supporting them by providing bulk discounts for different fertilizers, different kinds of programs where we can potentially in the future provide carbon credits or incentives in that kind of way. We network them and connect them to other farms so that they can share information. We end up entering into a bulk buying agreement and a long-term buying agreement so that they know for sure that they're going to have job security as well. Because for a farmer, really, at the end of the day, all you really want to do is focus on farming. The marketing and selling of a product is kind of a headache. And we help advocate for them to get import licenses and all of the documentation needed by the EPA, USDA, FDA as a means of bringing it into the United States. And so we do our best to also celebrate and share our farmers' stories because they're the ones doing the work, right? Like at the end of the day, I'm tinkering around with DNA in a lab and like that's cool, but they're the ones who are producing the base level nutrition and ingredients that go into our supply chain. And so a lot of what we do is to support them however possible.
So is it giving them an alternative kind of crop to grow that's going to, pay them a lot higher for volume?
Well, so we've been approached by a couple of farms that have been growing stuff like corn or soy or alfalfa or like broccoli or other things like that, right? And one of the key things that they're asking is, can you show us success stories or models or metrics in which somebody implemented like an algae farm and was able to start generating money from that in a way that like, because it's a specialty crop, because you get paid more per kilo or something like that. They're really willing to switch. We've had a bunch of inbound leads asking us to help them set up farming. And I think that's a really clear indicator. Not only are farmers adaptive and willing to try new things, but also this is a potential driver of reducing the effects of climate change and absorbing more CO2 in that kind of way. So I'm really excited about incentive programs to enable farmers to do stuff like that. And we kind of serve as a bit of a pass-through loan certifier, meaning that if a farmer wanted a loan to get set up with a farm, we could say, hey, we're going to buy from this farmer as soon as their crop is ready. And we can certify that we're going to consistently buy from this farm so they know they're going to make income off of it. And it turns into a really virtuous cycle. For us, our kind of end of things right now is making sure that we have enough demand to support all of these farmers however possible.
The fascinating ecosystem. Use this term, which I think is really fascinating, is just like as a kind of an analog to meat, but like using all parts of the buffalo, right? And talk to us about like how that looks today with just doing pigments and like how that gets separated and what that might look like.
Yeah.
As far as like, really making full use of everything that gets harvested.
Yeah. So I think one of the key challenges in any of these emerging technologies, whether it's fermentation or algae growth or anything like that, is that we're normally focused on one particular compound. And that's partially from the techniques and technologies that it stems from, which is all from pharmaceutical development, biopharma, whatnot, because you're focused on producing insulin. You don't care about anything else, right? And so in particular, when we were approaching this problem, one of the key elements was, okay, first products that we're going to produce are going to be pigments, and these are going to be purified and extracted pigments. But the only way that you can go about producing this pigment right now, one of the main methods at least, is using solvents. And so you use these solvents to pull the pigment out. But what that means that is the rest of the organism is completely kind of degraded and trash. And you can bury it for carbon credit potentially, but besides that, you can't really use anything else. All the compounds are degraded. So for us, one of the key things that we took a look at is how do we pull out and separate the pigment similar in nature to separating coffee from the grounds, right? So we start with our algae grounds. We want to separate out the pigment. How do we go about doing that without having all of the grounds get in the remainder? And so we've been using a lot of really interesting membrane techniques as means of separating out the pigments from everything else. And then I hope we'll be able to implement this at scale so that we can use all parts of the algae coming on up. Right now, we've been predominantly focused on pigments because we haven't been able to successfully scale to like a third-party processor our new techniques. And that's currently what we're working on in the lab.
So at scale, you'd be able to have food companies, textile companies, or food companies using it for protein and for pigments, kind of, and just have it all feeding off the same kind of waste stream.
I mean, the key thing that I relate Spira more to like a Cargill or an ADM in terms of supplying, or a Dow DuPont, right? What we want to do is fundamentally change the supply chain. And so we're subsisting on ingredients that are carbon negative. And the impact that we're making is displacing other compounds or petrochemicals that are out there. And so by doing that, that means that we provide a new pillar of potential use for the entire supply chain. I think one of the challenges that we're facing is that there aren't many tools that are currently available to work with algae, and we've had to develop a lot of our own tools to work with organisms like Oscillatoria species or Spirulina, or like even some of these other genetic oddballs that are out there. And so in doing so, I think that what we're trying to do is set up a way of supplying not only food companies with new pigments, flavors, fragrances, texturizing ingredients, proteins, potentially like carbohydrates, fats, other things like that, but starting to take those same ingredients and apply them in other places that you have harm from the petrochemicals industry.
Yeah, that is a good segue to the next part. So like, I guess scare us a little bit about, the current status quo of these petrochemicals, where they show up. I guess a lot of it is on our clothes, but
yeah,
I'd talk about the food implications as well. What's making its way into our food? What's it doing to us?
Got it. I'm going to talk directly in the camera right now. If we don't do anything to change our current supply chain in the next 10 years, the world will irreparably descend into chaos and anarchy, especially in coastal regions. Like already, just look at LA with just a little bit of rain over the past couple days. It's insane. So to kind of belittle the effects of climate change is not taking into full account the actual ramifications of what's going on. The days are getting hotter. The actual climate is swinging back and forth in various ways, in disastrous implications. And what this really means is that our entire food ecosystem is going to change. And a lot of the core crops that we rely on, ranging from like coffee all the way to animal agriculture, is going to completely just upend because it's not going to be the same. And so in particular, when I look at the kind of anti-fragility of systems, this idea of as things get more chaotic and more tense and more problematic, what you really want are localized structures and localized food systems that can supply just your basic nutrition wherever you are. And so a lot of what me and the team ended up doing, this is back in 2017, we were investigating different ways of implementing those kind of systems. And we took a trip to Munich to meet with the World Food Program to see if we could do the same kind of thing that I did in a garage space in Richmond, Virginia, at a refugee camp in Kenya.
Wow.
And the idea was bring Spirulina with me and then give enough to have these different judges from the World Food Program, Innovation Program, test it to see if we could actually grow enough that they could have a sample in the span of just a couple days. And the entire point was, what is a rapid response to refugee programs? And we're going to have tons of climate refugees all over the world. And so in particular, what I did was hid all of these 3-ounce little bottles, like mouthwash bottles, in my suitcase, because you have a limit to how much like liquid you can bring. Mm-hmm. So I put all of my spirulina culture in these little 3-ounce bottles, and I grew it on my windowsill in the hotel in Munich, and then served it to all of these judges at this World Food Program accelerator. And when I realized in their response, they were amazed. But the caveat to all of that is that the entrenched systems and programs that we have do not support the growth of the base level nutrition on site. So the World Food Program wouldn't exist if there was a way to produce all the nutrition locally. And so they have an internal memo dissuading the use of moringa, baobab, and spirulina, all of which are local crops in Central Africa, and partially because they're supporting entrenched food systems. And so a lot of the organizations and institutions that we are relying on as a means of supplying the base level nutrition are being rocked by this climate catastrophe that's about to occur. They have no clue how to shift or change. And it's kind of up to each of us as a means of adopting new forms of nutrition. Maybe venturing into an adaptive or different kind of mentality when it comes to embracing new technologies as well. There's been a lot of push and motivation, especially by our parents' generation, who saw Monsanto in the 1970s do all sorts of horrible things to agriculture. And therefore, we have this reaction to non-GMO. I think that in terms of being able to get past all of this climate catastrophe and really embrace all these tools that can enable this abundant future that I really dream of, we need to embrace all the tools. We need to be able to try as many things as possible, because just sticking to these monoculture, mass scale, big agriculture crops that we are used to, the kind of like 13 vegetables and 5 animals that we always eat, is not going to be it. And especially when most of the arable land in which those are produced is going away. So we need to shift and adapt to crops that are resilient and anti-fragile in that way. I hope that's not too scary.
No, I mean, I think, you give us a lot of hope. You and companies like yours, I mean, we got to be firing on all cylinders here.
Yeah. I think there's enough time to right the ship. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this, right? So I do think that at the core of it, it's really important that we test and try out as many different things as possible.
I guess talk about kind of this idea of like a circular local kind of system, economy around algae, and what that might look like in the future. Right now it involves, shipping cultures out to Southeast Asia and then having it come all the way back.
Yeah.
There's companies working on this from a fermentation standpoint that are doing vertical farming, I guess, of algae, and that's their vision, right? How do you get this to become something that is more decentralized, hyperlocal?
Yeah. I think a lot of that stems on it from like relying on the farmers as kind of the core of a system of any sort. And one of the things that I didn't mention in the history of the company is that we sold home bioreactors for a time. So for about 2 years, I sold a home system in which you could flip a tap and be able to get a shot of spirulina every day. And in doing so, the idea was to enable people to provide for their own basic nutrition in the same kind of way that I did when I first got started. And I still think that that is kind of core to the ethos of what we're doing, is reforming the supply chain so it's hyper-local and enabling people to be able to produce on site. So in a building like this, as an example, like even 100,000 square feet or something like that would be able to supply nutrition for most of Los Angeles.
Wow.
If you were growing algae in, vertical farm style arrangement of some sort.
Like a fermentation process or actual pond?
No, these would be sort of like flat walled plates and like stacked together, and you'd have to have a lot of density. But like to that point, if you wanted base level protein, you could do it in tiny space if you really wanted to. And so when I'm imagining a future of us being able to provide for our basic necessities, I think of it kind of like we're in a biosphere of sorts, right? We are in this beautiful pale blue dot of Earth, and we have this ability of providing for all of our basic necessities. But if the Earth is off kilter, then imagine us in more hyperlocal systems, these little tiny biospheres of the local communities that we're surrounded by. I think that it would be amazing to provide for the basic ingredients that go into the tacos that you eat on your taco crawl, or being able to provide for all of the different perfume ingredients or all of the different cosmetic ingredients, as opposed to having these giant international global supply chains. And the only ingredients that we really need are sun, air, water, and a little bit of salt. And so that's really key to our central ethos. And eventually I imagine our company transforming from more of this hub and spoke model, where it's all coming to Los Angeles and coming out from there, to something that's more like a land and expand is what I call it, where if we're producing a pigment in India, we would be able to supply textile producers in India with that pigment as a means of dyeing that fabric before it went to a manufacturer. And so it's all manufactured and then sold locally. And that's really key, is that we want to bring our supply chains closer to us, bring our businesses closer to us, so that we have more of a relationship with the basic materials, ingredients, and things that we use on a day-to-day basis. And we have a whole lot more respect for them, and have this idea of, okay, well, when this is done, what happens to it? And since we're producing biological-based materials, it all breaks down and degrades in the environment. Like, you can throw this away and not have to worry about it sticking around. And that's really key, is the ability to potentially toss something or exchange it for something else, and then not have to worry about what happens next.
When we talk about like getting us to a point where these major CPG companies start to reevaluate their ingredients, and we think about the incentives in our food system and what is going on with, the USDA ensuring the prices of commodity crops, etc. How do we get to a point where this is a financially no-brainer, a financial no-brainer for a company to say, we want to swap this out? It's not just that we're doing it out of the goodness of our heart because we care about the planet.
Yeah.
How do we get to a point of price parity, and where are we right now?
Yeah. So I would say that there's probably like 3 layers here. So the first is, you talked about agriculture. And I would kind of classify what we're doing as very much like more agriculture technology or biotech, or like we do a lot in food technology. But a lot of what I've done in the past is take a look at agriculture policies to figure out where is that tipping point. And whenever you take a look at the Farm Bill, that subsidized agriculture, especially in crop insurance for staple crops. If you have something labeled as a staple crop, it ends up receiving crop insurance. Therefore, farmers are able to plant that crop, not have to worry about flooding, weather damage, anything like that. They still get money from the government if the crop fails. Therefore, I think that the removal of crop insurance from subsidies is going to be one of the most impactful things to agriculture. You see this mirrored in what happened to New Zealand in the 1970s. And what is probably happening to India right now with a lot of the farmers. The government decided to remove a lot of those subsidies, a lot of that crop insurance, and it completely transformed the agriculture, therefore making New Zealand one of the most prominent agricultural producers in the entire area, because they had to innovate. They couldn't stick to same old staple crops. So I think number one thing that we can do legislatively is probably remove that, remove the crop insurance provision of the Farm Bill. I mean, the second thing is to enable these kind of like financial structures that I was talking about before. So if you could provide a loan to a farmer to experiment with something new, a new kind of crop, it actually enables this really positive feedback loop, especially if you're orienting that in a climate-centric manner. And so demonstrating the fact that they're able to make more of an income on specialized crops, experimenting with new things, means that we have a much more robust and to handle any of these climate shocks, right? The more diversity and biodiversity we have, the better it is. And then lastly, I think that one of the key things about these companies is the recognition that you are going, I call it death by 1,000 cuts. Many of these big companies, whether it's Campbell's Soup or Kellogg's or General Mills or any of these big food companies, are now having their market share eaten away by small companies.
Right.
And what they end up doing at the end of the day is just buying whoever's the biggest. And they incorporate that company into their brand, and they just keep on doing that. And so in order to start adopting more of this innovation mindset in something that's a little bit more rapid, I think that many of these companies need to really enable their innovation teams within the company, kind of like what DARPA does for its program managers, where it says, hey, we're going to give you a big budget to go find and seed innovation teams all over the place and pay for pilots and pay for really robust pilots so that we can actually see what is going to be the most effective at implementing in any kind of way. The risk that they're taking on at such a large scale, the exposure. I was talking to McDonald's innovation team as an example, and I had no clue how I got in the room with McDonald's innovation team, but they serve 67 million people every single day. They're not going to work with a small startup of like 15 or so people. They're not going to do that. And the only reason that they're talking to these startups is as a means of saving face when they go to report to a chief innovation officer or somebody else like that at the company and say, hey, you know, we talked to this many startups. This is the metric that we're working on. If you make their job a lot easier and a lot more effective, where you can showcase, hey, there's this marketing push or something else that they can end up doing, then it makes it so that the big companies start shifting and adopting things far faster. And I mean, I think that we really need to disconnect a lot of these food tech companies from this hype cycle where it's overpromising and under-delivering. Otherwise, nobody's going to believe them in the first place. Many of these big food companies buy into the hype cycle, though, and put money into something that'll get a lot of press, but isn't actually something implementable. And so you see this greenwashing happening all of the time. And so the only thing that can really make a difference is focusing in on local tests, pilot tests, and these companies actually putting money where their mouth is and it's spending real money to support young startups.
Love it. Preach that all day. Kind of as we come out of this, come towards the end of this conversation, it's been really eye-opening, and a lot has been over my head, but I'm definitely learning a lot. But what do you see as kind of, if you were to, you talked about McDonald's, like if you had it your way, I don't know if that's Burger King or McDonald's, it's one of them.
Yeah.
What would that look like? What are some of the applications that you would be excited to see 10 years from now to help us put us on the right track when it comes to food and beverage? You've hinted at some of them. We've talked about algae burgers. Yeah. You can get those today. We can get Spirulina as an expensive protein smoothie add-on. We can do Elliot's cream cheese Spirulina kind of schmear.
Sure.
But what are some really out there ideas on that thread of like you have your own like little system at home that you can hit a button, like what does that thing spitting out?
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of what I like doing in terms of self-experimentation is playing with that very edge of the possible, right? So like whether it's coming up with my own hair dye that's based on algae or working on, I taught a class on genetically engineering perfumes and doing different things related to like scent and time-dependent release of perfumes or scent memory or other things like that. I think that my dream, and I think the dream of most food scientists, if you had the ability, is to create a food replicator of some sort.
Yeah.
And this idea where you have a device where you could come up to it and say Earl Grey tea hot, and then press a button and it would do that, right? And I think with something that is known as like a digital to biological converter, you can go from information to actual implementable biological material. And something like that, when this is a far off future, would enable us to get closer to that like home growing unit, the kind of food replicator that we're looking for. And we would be able to implement new smells or taste or textures in the organisms while they're growing in there as the main starting material. And so you could potentially get something to spit out like maybe a familiar food like a hot dog or like a hamburger or something like that. Or it could be something completely designed that we have no clue exists yet. And to me, like I take a lesson from hummus. And hummus is just blended chickpeas, right?
Yeah.
Blended garbanzo beans. And before Sabra came along, no one knew about hummus. They came up with the name hummus. Hummus doesn't really even mean much of anything. And so I like to take a look at the foods now, and I'm like, well, why are we trying to recreate the same foodstuffs that we've always had? Why are we trying to make the cream cheeses or the jerky or the whatever it is, right? And just represent it in a different kind of way. Why can't we just imagine a future in which the foods that we eat and the representations that they're in, like whoever invented PB&J in the first place was a genius. So like things like that, where one of my heroes besides Willy Wonka is George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver took the peanut and then came up with 300 different uses for it. And so for me, I take a look at algae and I'm like, how do I come up with as many uses as possible so that it becomes a core staple of our food supply chain? So it becomes a core staple of what we're using on a day-to-day basis. So that 10 years from now, when I pack for a trip or I'm going on an expedition or something like that, I'll be packing things, and most of the things that I bring with me, if not all of them, have something algae related in them. And then that's really what I'm looking for and working towards.
Well, can't wait to see that future. As you were describing that, I was thinking OpenAI meets food replicator with algae in it. I was like, just spit out, just like keep feeding on this AI and keep coming up with that next peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah. Whatever's the next PB&J, you've heard it here.
Elliot, this has been an amazing conversation.
Awesome.
I'm all in on algae now. I was dipping my toe in the pond, so to speak, before, but now you have me convinced. If brands are listening to this, tell them how they can get samples, how they can get started.
Sure.
If there's any roles you're hiring for, or just anything in general, people want to learn more, how do they get it?
Yeah, of course. All of our socials are at Spira Inc., SPIRAINC. If you want to get samples, we give out free samples all the time. So seriously, if you email us, info@spirainc.com, and or go to our website, you have the ability to request samples through the contact form or just order them straight up through the products page. We are shipping out blue, green, red, yellow. We're going to have an updated version of the red, possibly an orange coming on out. Those are secret. So you heard it here first. Breaking news. Woo! Some of the other things that are going on, we are opening up our official seed fundraise. We've been quite quiet the past couple of years and have only raised a tiny bit of money, and then have been making most of our money through sales or grants. So this is the first official opportunity to invest in Spira. If you want to invest, you can contact me, Elliot at Spira Inc., ELLIOT. But then beyond that, we're hiring. So a couple of different roles, mostly in the laboratory here in Los Angeles. We're hiring for bioengineers. We're hiring for chemical engineers. And then in particular, we're looking for a couple of people that are going to help in terms of marketing and sales. So if you fit any of those roles, if you're interested, please reach out. More than happy to connect.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you're curious to get a first-hand look at the cutting edge of food and tech, check out hungry.tv. That's Hungry with no U, where you can join in on live conversations like these or sign up for the free weekly newsletter.